Hey, this is Guy from New Plastic. Today we're going to be making this melting brain effect using Cinema 4D's native tools, no plugins needed. In part 2, I'm going to show you how to do this with RealFlow, which can get more exciting and realistic results. Just a little side note, this is a pretty resource intensive and complex workflow. You're going to be waiting for things to load and to bake. I sped up and cut down most of my waiting times just for the sake of the tutorial. And you can reduce the number of particles and mesh resolution in your project to speed up the process. But that's why I'm doing these tutorials, so that you don't have to waste time trying things that might not work. If you still have any questions, hit me up on Instagram at ojang or comment on this video. But yeah, take this technique, apply it in your projects, have fun with it. And with that being said, let's go. So we're going to start off by setting our square ratio 1080 by 1080. We're going to set our rendering engine to Octane Renderer. We're going to set a plane, which is going to be our wall background. It's going to be just a flat wall in the background. And let's set this right window to be in perspective mode so we can move around without moving our camera on the left window. And let's just add a cube so we know our scale. And we're going to use a pretty big brain. It's not going to be a realistic size brain. That's going to help with our simulation. Now we're going to set a little stage for the brain to melt on. And let's set a camera. And this smaller cube is just acting as a placeholder for now for the brain, just so we see what we're working with. And we're just going to round out the edges a little bit on the stage. And we can get rid of it. Now get your brain model. You can find a bunch of them for free online. I'm going to link this one in the description. Just make sure you're aware of the license of the model that you're using. I just copied the two lobes. I didn't copy the whole, back parts. For this tutorial and for this image, that'll be enough. Let's scale up our brain so that it'll fit the size that we want, and looking pretty good. Now let's just name everything, and we can start by, first of all, putting our brain in a volume builder. Set it pretty small voxel size, and you can see that if we add a smooth layer, set it on mean, it's looking pretty good. It's pretty much almost the same as our model, because yeah, that's what we want. Now first of all, we're going to set this cube. In this cube, we're going to move it from right to left, and it's going to slowly chip away the brain. You see, it's going to move like that, and it's slowly going to make our brain disappear from left to right. And that will be our first move. Now you see the size of the cube. The size is pretty important for later on, so just keep it this size. And you can animate it just by keyframing it. I'm going to use Signal. It doesn't really matter. You can just use keyframes. I'm going to animate the X position. And the Signal is a great plugin. I use it for almost anything. It's so much easier to animate simple things like that. So now we can drag the cube in the volume builder, set the mode to subtract, hide the cube, and let's just turn up our voxel size so we get faster response. And now if we hit play, you can see that the cube is moving in a diagonal line instead of in a straight line from right to left on the x-axis. So now I'm fast forwarding my attempts to figure out what's happening. I was kind of confused because it kept moving in diagonal, and then I realized it was the orientation of the cube. I had to set the parent, which is the volume mesher, to 0 degrees rotation, and then set the brain to -55 degrees rotation. And then the brain was oriented right, and the volume mesher was oriented right, and then I could set the cube on 0 degrees rotation, and it would move along the x-axis and not on both axes. And now it looks good. So now I can animate it again on the x-axis from right to left using Signal or using keyframes. And I want the endpoint of the cube to completely take over the brain. I'm going to set it to subtract. I'm going to And now you see that once it's done, yeah, you can see that it's slowly kind of eating away the brain. Let's name it. And we're going to copy the brain. We can hide this for now. We're done with that. Now we're going to create the fluid. Now for the fluid, what we're going to do is we're going to build a brain out of tiny spheres. So we're going to grab a sphere and clone it a bunch of times. Let's reduce the size of our sphere. Let's reduce the segments. Let's set the cloner to object mode. And now we're going to copy our brain and we're going to scale it down just by a little bit. But we're not going to scale it down. We're going to extrude it inside. So we're going to select all of our polygons and extrude it just a tiny bit inside. So all the polygons are offsetted inside. And we're going to use that smaller brain as our cloner object. I'm going to set it to volume. I'm going to reduce our segments on the spheres a little bit. And we're going to add a lot of clones because we need the whole brain to be filled up with spheres. And that's still a lot of space inside. So let's increase the size and maybe even more. So 3 might work. Now let's add a simulation tag. I'm going to set it apply to children, top level, 0 bounce, 300 friction. A little bit of damping and follow rotation so they won't scatter all around. Let's add a collider tag on the larger brain. Set it to static mesh and 0 bounce. And now let's increase our steps and collision margin to 0. And now if we hit play, you can see that the spheres don't kind of fill up the whole brain to the brim. We really want the whole brain to be filled with spheres. So let's increase the size to 4 of the spheres. And now if we hit play, that looks pretty good, but you see some of them are escaping, so they're a bit too tight. So let's do 3.5. And now we can see our whole brain is full of spheres and none of them are intersecting. And we're good now. So now we're going to copy the cube that we used to eat away our original brain. And before that, let's set initial state on the cloners. And we're going to apply a ghost dynamics tag on the copied cube. And we're going to use that to activate the dynamics on the spheres. So let's set a collider tag on our stand. We'll disable the collider tag on our brain. And we'll set the dynamics tag on our cloners to trigger on collision. Let's hide the brain for now. And now you can see we have a brain made out of spheres. And I'm just going to set the curve of the cube movement to linear. You can set it to whatever you want, but just make sure all the cubes are animating at the same pace with the same curve because they all have to move in synchronicity for this effect to work. And we're going to hide our cube. If we hit play, we can see that as the cube goes to the left, it activates the spheres it touches, and they start to get the dynamics applied on them. So that's really cool. So it pretty much acts like the particles slowly start to disintegrate from the right or to fall. Now I'm gonna set a little slope on the stand because I want the fluid to eventually fall down because we're gonna make a looping animation. So we need it to start with no fluid on the stand and end with no fluid on the stand. So for that, we're gonna create this little slope and the fluid is gonna kind of roll off the stand at the end of the animation. Now we're going to set low bounce and very high friction because again, we don't want the balls to scatter all around. And now if you hit play, you see that it's all good. Now I went ahead and I did all these things. I baked them as a limbic, put them in a volume mesher, but then I realized they're not fully out of the frame. The spheres are not fully out of the frames once I'm done at the end of the animation. So I deleted it, went back and started reducing friction. so that the fluid is gonna, roll down faster. So as it touches the slope, it's gonna roll down faster. And I just want to check that at the end of the animation, there's no more fluid on the slope. And as you can see, there's still fluid there, so I'm going to reduce the friction even more on the slope. I'm going to set a little bit of bounce. And let's also try and reduce the friction on the balls. Now I want, while they're in a brain shape, I want them to have friction. But as soon as they start touching and rolling off the slope, I want them to slowly reduce the friction. So I'm animating the friction down on the balls. And now, as you can see, once they're fully on the slope, their friction becomes less and less. And it's still, they're almost out of the frame, but still not enough. So I'm just going to increase the frame amount on our animation, just so we can reach the, yeah. And now you can see we reached the end and the particles are pretty much gone. I'm going to bake this whole cloner thing into a limbic. And once we're done, we got all the cloners as an limbic animation. Let's hide our dynamic cloner. And let's set the Alembic particles in a volume builder. And we're going to copy the cube inside, but now instead of subtract, we're not going to set it, we're going to set it to intersect. So now instead of eating away all the particles, it's revealing all of our particles. It's doing the opposite of what our original brain mesh is doing. And let's set a little smooth layer. And our voxel size is pretty big. We're going to reduce it, but for now you can see what we're actually doing. And I accidentally removed the cube from our original brain. So let's bring it back and set it to subtract. And now we got two different animations. One of a whole brain getting slowly eaten away, chipped away, and another of our particles falling down, slowly being revealed. And if we decrease the voxel size, we get a lot of details, but it's actually too much detail. So we want to reduce the detail. We want to make a more of a jelly kind of animation. It's just that detail doesn't really look good. The particles show too much. So for that, we're going to increase the voxel range threshold, and that's going to kind of increase the size, the range of our mesh. And we're going to drag the whole volume mesher particle thing into the brain volume builder. And as you can see now, it combines both of them. It has a little seam there. So we're going to offset the cube that reveals the particles. We're going to offset its animation back by 1 frame, which means the particles are going to revealed slightly earlier, and that's going to overlap into the subtracted brain animation. And inside the volume mesher, it's going to blend them more smoothly. And now let's increase the voxel size. So we reduce the detail on our fluid even more. So now the voxel size is 3. And look at all this goo. Our brain is becoming a goo. And we're just gonna bake this whole thing into a limbic. So once we're done, we're gonna deactivate all of our volume meshers and hide them. And we got an alembic. Beautiful. Now we want the animation to loop. So we're going to go to the first frame and set current state to object. So now we got the model of our brain. And we're going to bring it into the end of the animation to the exact same position so it'll loop. So we're going to keyframe or use signal the position. So I'm animating the Y position. So it'll kind of slide from the top right towards as our animation ends. So it's going to start at around 110 and it's going to finish at 140. Right at the end of our animation. And let's just make sure it's all aligned. And it's going to start all the way up there. And there you go. It's coming in. with a very strong ease out, so it kind of eases into its position really smoothly. There you have it. So I'm going to click on the film icon bottom right, untick all frames, and now it plays the animation in the actual speed. And it looks good. Alright, so now I'm going to give it a slight rotation as it slides in, as the brain slides in. You can keyframe it. I'm using Signal. And we're just going to end in our original position of the brain, and we're going to start from a slight degree. So as it moves in, it also kind of rotates in. And I'm going to increase the ease out and copy that and paste it into my time so that they'll both do the same, have the same curve. And there you go. Now it moves and rotates at the same time. And now you can see that our animation is working fine. It's perfectly looping and it's all good. Now let's take all of our dynamic process and group them and just hide them for now. Great. Let's start lighting. So we're going to set up an HDRI link on our Octane Sky, drag the file in, pick your favorite interior or exterior HDRI, and let's see how it looks. Now we're going to set our path tracing kernel. And for now, that's all. Enable denoising. Let's rotate our Octane Sky. This looks cool. A little bit of highlight from the left. Now let's compare the first and the last frame, just so we can see that in terms of lighting, it looks the same. And as you can see, there's a slight shadow at the top right corner. That's because in the first frame, we have our brain hovering above everything outside of the frame. And in the last frame, we don't. So let's just take it up a little bit. And now we don't have that shadow. Let's set up a light. It's going to be a backlight. And it's just going to give us some accents on, like rim accents on the brain. Let's turn off our camera visibility and also turn off our opacity so that other light rays can pass through it. So now it doesn't cast this shadow on our back wall. Let's move it around a little bit, scale it down. Turn it down a little bit, and yeah, we got a little rim accent on it. Looks okay. Let's bring another light source, take it all the way to the right, scale it all the way up. That's going to be kind of our key light. It's way too strong, so let's reduce it all the way down. And now we got this nice highlight from the right side. Let's copy the light again, and we're going to set a little disk light to light up our background. Now let's start texturing. So bring down metallic, set it on GGX, and I'm just gonna give a little bit of noise textures to the roughness. Get a lot of detail on that noise. I just want a little bit of black, a lot of roughness, a lot of roughness, a little bit of highlights here and there. Get our octane gradient. Now set another one for the bump. Increase the size by a lot and then reduce the contrast by a lot. So we're gonna make our gradient almost the same colors. Very low contrast, so the bump is very light. I'm gonna set another noise texture in the metallic, and we're gonna use chips for that. And we just want these tiny kind of chips to show. And we're gonna use it also for the color. So we're gonna set a gradient. We're gonna take our background color as the black and then the chips as white. And that's gonna give us kind of those specks. I'm gonna take that chip texture and also combine it using the add node with our bump map. So now those white chips are bumped up. Now, this is gonna be our slope texture, the stage texture. I want it to be kind of rubbery, kind of a lot of subsurface scattering for that. So let's use our subsurface scattering and bring down the density. And I don't like that strong highlight on the slope. And I think that's coming from that backlight. So let's just move it around until the slope doesn't catch it as much. And that looks good. Now we're gonna copy our subsurface scattering node material. I'm gonna apply it on the brain. Now we can't use any noise or any texture because the UV maps are really horrible when we're using these techniques. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use the dirt node. And as you can see, now we have access to the crevices, which can give us some range and detail. Let's pass it through a gradient node and set the black to be very red and the white to be kind of like a brain, like a very light pink, very light pink texture. And as you can see, we got a little cool brain texture going on. I'm gonna attach that gradient to the albedo on the SSS. Make the black a little stronger, which is the red. Let's reduce our roughness because we want it to be more shiny than the slope. And in order for the SSS to show a little more, we need to darken the albedo. So we're going to use about the same gradient node, but all the colors darker. And now we want to make it the whole thing a bit lighter. The darker the albedo, the more the object is transparent, so the more the SSS shows. But I do want it to be a bit lighter, so let's introduce some bias, which means it's going to introduce some albedo in. I'm not really sure what it's doing, but it just makes it a bit lighter. And yeah, let's increase our index of refraction. Let's add a little bit of coating layer just to get some more shininess. And let's reduce all of our temperature of our lights to 5500 to get some warmer colors. And look at that. That's so cool. Man, that's so cool. Now let's take our highlight compression all the way up just so we get some more details in the highlight. And set the exposure up a little bit to kind of brighten up the image. Now I want the brain to stick out more, so let's increase the color strength. Then let's try a different background lighting. And from the bottom, I like how the background is lit from the bottom. We're gonna do that. Now, let's set both of our SSS materials to GGX. And I want to make the slope a bit darker, kind of closer to the background color. And now you can see the brain way better. The contrast is way better here. but we're going to even increase the contrast. So we're going to make the background color a bit darker and stronger. And I'm just playing around with the amount of SSS on the slope. The higher the density, the less the SSS shows. And I want less detail in the wall in the background, just because it attracts too much attention. So I'm just gonna reduce the amount of bump. Just reduce the amount of texture on the back wall. I want to keep some texture, but just reduce it by a little. I'm playing around with the colors and just seeing what works better. And again, playing around with the SSS on the slope. You know, I keep kind of dialing in, moving around, trying different settings, see what looks better. And this looks good. Just playing around with the lighting. And let's set a little top light. As you can see, it gives us a more lit up scene. I don't want this lighting, the scene to be too dramatic. I want it to be well lit. And now, since we introduced the top light, let's check again our first and last frame just to see that the brain doesn't obstruct the lighting. And as you can see, our first frame is darker. Yeah, first frame on the right, it's darker because the brain that is kind of hiding up there in the first frame, it's obstructing the light, the top light that we just introduced. So we're gonna need to kind of move it out the way. We don't want it to stand there the whole animation. So we're gonna move it out of the way. And I chose to just move it into the Z space. So as the animation goes on the first frame, all the first frames, it's not going to be obstructing our top light. As you can see now, first and last frames are exactly this. Oh wait, yeah. So now first frame and last frames are exactly the same. And the brain at some point is gonna appear. Now, I changed it a little in my last render. What I did is, instead of having the brain kind of pop in like I did here, I made it slowly move in on the Z space as it moves it down too. So then yeah, just a little change I did. And I'm playing around with the slope color and playing around with the light intensity. So I'm trying to see if the backlight can act as a better separation between the slope and the background. And I also made the background more pink, just so it won't, there's going to be more contrast with the fluids color and the slope color. So now you can, you really see the fluid nicely on it. And again, just playing around with the density. And that looks good. I want the SSS to be kind of subtle. Still apparent, but I don't want it to look like a wax or rubber. I want it to look, or maybe it does, but not too strong. And we actually don't really need that backlight. I think it brings too much highlights on the fluid. Yeah. There you go. Let's combine all of our lighting, group them together. And yeah, that's beautiful. Let's set it to render. So OpenEXR as our format. Let's give the render a name. That's very important. And we're going to copy that name, paste it into the render passes. add a little indication that it's the passes, set it to EXR Octane, set the tone map type to tone mapped, shadow, transmission, denoise beauty, denoise reflection, set the max samples on our info channels to 1000, shading normals, and not object layer, but ambient occlusion. And we're going to reduce the distance of our ambient occlusion. That looks okay. Here's our indirect reflections. This is our shadow. Let's just make sure it's not really noisy. It looks okay. Transmission is nothing, so let's turn it off and turn on SSS instead. Now we got the SSS pass. And as you can see, got the denoise. Let's set our static noise on, and that's gonna make sure our noise is not gonna dance around. You can see it's a bit noisy. The SSS is a bit noisy, but with the denoise, it's fine. So after I finished rendering, I noticed a few issues, so I went back and fixed a few things. The first thing that I did was I went to the volume builder of the particles. I changed the voxel distance on the smooth layer from 1 to 2, and then animated the strength from 50 to 100, from frame 40 to 70, which made the goo slowly become more smooth, and all these particles around the goo kind of were more contained and were less scattery. So that made the liquid animation end a bit sooner. So I reduced the amount of overall frames in the scene until the liquid was just outside of the frame at the last frame, which also meant I had to pull back the animation of the brain coming from the top at the end. So I had to start its animation earlier and end it earlier. The other thing I did was I duplicated the brain material and then added a flow texture to the opacity. And then I animated flow texture from when the brain that's coming in, when it's halfway, to right before it enters the frame. I animated the flow texture from 0 to 1. So as the brain comes in, the opacity increases and increases. That just made sure there's no sudden shadows popping in once the brain comes into the frame and obstructs the light. And the last thing I did, I just raised the stage up by 1 centimeter on the y-axis so that the liquid in the stage would have more contact. So there you go. This is how the final animation looks like. I got the idea for this from a series of animations that I made on my Instagram where I used RealFlow to melt the brain. So stay tuned for the next tutorial that's going to show you how to do that with RealFlow. But how fucking cool that you can do this with Cinema's native tools. It's pretty incredible. Again, if you have any questions, suggestions, remarks, anything, hit me up on Instagram at ojang or comment on this video. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Peace.